Dennis, I'm always fascinated to see arguments that theists, believers use, which they think supports their position, but in fact digs big holes right beneath them to which they fall in. Now, in looking at some of these fallacies, as a believer and as a scientist, what do you say?
Yeah, I think that's amazing, isn't it? And actually, people don't learn from history either. That's even more amazing. But yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a few of those actually. And I think God of the gaps sort of ideas are very, very common, in the history of apologetics is one. In a sense, you're talking about apologetics, how believers try and justify their beliefs. And usually what often they do is to point to something that we don't yet in science understand very well, like the origin of life or the bacterial flagellum, how exactly it came into being or something like that, and then they say, here's a gap in the scientific story. So God did it, and they bring God in to just sort of explain those kind of current gaps and sort of ignorance that we have at the moment. And of course, what happens obviously is that those gaps close, the scientific story gets better, and that God sort of shrinks. And this has been likened to that famous cat in Alice in Wonderland, that cat that was smiling and then it gradually disappeared, and so God becomes the disappearing cat in Alice in Wonderland. And that's not very satisfactory. And there's been quite a few of those, I think, as well. And sometimes people have, used brain science and things. Well, the mind is something we can't really understand. It's some way God is located in the mind in a way that's a bit spooky and mysterious. And now, of course, neuroscience has begun to understand the brain in a much more thorough way, although very much incomplete way. But I think it's very dangerous, to put a sort of gap there in the mind as if somehow that's the special location of God. So I think the God of the gaps argument in all its various exemplars, has been very, very kind of misused over the years.
If we look at the history of religion and science, we see science gradually painting religion into a tighter and tighter corner as religion has its frontiers rolling back because of where they define their frontiers. How should religion define what they are so that won't happen anymore? Can religion even do that?
Well, I think religion needs to go back to the sort of philosophy of the early founders of the Royal Society. If you look at the early founders of the Royal Society in the mid-17th century, I mean, these were people of deep religious faith, and they saw it almost as their mission to try and understand this amazing world that God had brought into being. And so they saw all their activities as uncovering the wonders of creation, uncovering what God had done, and actually saw it as part of their worship. And I think it's important for religious people to, recapture that sense of when they do their science, it's part of their worship. I mean, when I go to my lab, I don't use sort of God language in the lab or try and use the language of theology to understand immunology or the brain or whatever it is. But I am amazed by what I discover, and I see that as part of my worship. I think, uncovering what God has done in the created order is a duty that religious people have and should be seen as part of their religious activity. So I think this sort of division, sharp division of sort of religion, science, and all this sort of thing into little watertight compartments is a bit dangerous, really. And I think religious people should integrate their lives and see their science. If they happen to be scientists, they should see that science as part of their worship and part of their understanding of what God has done. And it was Kepler, the early astronomer, who talked about thinking God's thoughts after him, when he was doing his astronomy. And actually Kepler trained to be a Lutheran pastor, but sort of then went to spend more time in early astronomy and so forth.
Thankfully.
And thankfully, and had this just wonderful concept, of the majesty of God. He actually thought of the spheres moving around in this sort of musical harmony and all this sort of thing, Very remarkable vision of the kind of wonderful God who made an amazing universe. So I don't think we should think of science, as it were, eroding upon the domain of religion, but rather science expanding our understanding and concept of who God is. And I think that gives a very different understanding of those relationships.
How do you feel as a scientist and a believer about philosophical language arguments that undermine religion? Logical positivists would say that religious language is completely meaningless. There's no truth value in any of the words. So it's like almost saying gobbledygook.
Gobbledygook. Well, that's an interesting one. Of course, I think the problem about logical positivism, first of all, as a formal philosophy, it's pretty much dead and buried now, certainly in philosophy departments. And there's a simple reason for that, because, logical positivism actually can't sustain its own basis, because if the only statements that you can make which are valid statements are scientific statements, then logical positivism is not a scientific statement and therefore has no basis. There's no reason to believe that it is the case. So I think people have likened it, to the classical thing where you're sitting on the branch and you're soaring the branch, but you're just soaring on the wrong side and you just fall down. And I think that's what happened to logical positivism and why it sort of eventually just couldn't be sustained.
But the language argument is a legitimate one. Are we dealing in religion with the kinds of words that carry meaning, that can have independent reality to it?
Well, I think language is defined by its usage. And, if you go all over the world, you find people with religious beliefs. And when they have religious beliefs, they make a difference to what they do in their lives, to the way they spend their money. They make great sacrifices in the name of religion. So clearly, religious language has impact on people's lives and what they do. And I see no reason, therefore, at all from a philosophical point of view, therefore, to say why should religious language be discounted for that reason. Any language that has huge impacts on people's beliefs and what they do in their daily lives, why isn't that real language? Now, there's a deeper question underlying that, of course, as to whether that language refers to something which actually exists. Yes, now, that's a separate kind of question. But I think the first base is the philosophical question as to whether the religious language plays a role and does work, and actually has effects. And I think the answer to that is yes, and when we go in the lab, we use metaphorical language all the time about things. We talk about black holes and all these things, and we then have to justify our beliefs on those, by evidence. So I think the believer would want to say, if they have real faith, they would want to say they have evidence-based faith. They have evidence for their beliefs, they have rational grounds for their beliefs, and therefore the religious language that they use does refer to something, which is beyond themselves, if you like, which is a transcendent reality. But I don't see any particular philosophical reason for undermining the value of religious language itself, because it's what human beings use and has a huge impact on their lives.
Let's take another example, and that is the proliferation of what we see often in the media of what seems to be cheap tricks purporting to be miracles that prove the existence of God. Illusion, delusion, charades, who knows what.
Yes.
People use that.
Yeah, people use that. Yeah, I have to say I'm pretty skeptical. In my family, they would say they're amazed that I'm a Christian because I'm so skeptical. My general default position is don't believe it. And I guess that's the scientific training, isn't it? When you read something in the press, generally speaking, I don't believe it. And I start from a position of disbelief. And so certainly I would come with great skepticism to all of these sort of miraculous cures and so on and so forth. And so I think there would be dangerous things to try and use probably as a justification for belief. I think people who put their trust in that kind of thing, might be on a little bit slippery ground there. But having said that, I personally, as a believer, I wouldn't want to exclude the possibility that God occasionally chooses to do something special. I see no reason that's a perfectly rational basis to have. If you believe in a God who cares for the universe, who cares for people, who's interested in their lives, I would certainly wouldn't want to exclude, how could I, that God couldn't choose to do something special. But I think to assign lots of these sort of fake kind of miracles, to God, it doesn't do him any favors, if I might put it in that way. It doesn't honor God in that way to say something's happened when really it's a delusion. So I take the sort of skeptics sort of general position on this, but I wouldn't want to go to an extreme skeptical position.